Welcome to INFOWARS Nightly News, this Monday, January 16th edition of 2012. This is Mike Adams, the Health Ranger, filling in for Alex Jones tonight. We have a lot of breaking news ahead for you here, and an interview with Ed Corcoran from Survivalist magazine is going to be talking to us about global events and the Strait of Hormuz in Iran, possibility of war with Iran, and many other topics. But first, breaking news on the GMO front. We have news right out of the state of Washington, where State Senator Marilyn Chase has introduced a bill that would require the labeling of genetically engineered foods sold in that state. Now, she says, quote, people have the right to know what they're eating. Can you imagine that? Now, this bill states that by July 2014, all genetically engineered raw foods must be clearly labeled with the words genetically engineered, and processed foods must include a label that states that the product may contain genetically engineered ingredients, and it must name those ingredients on the label. Now, you may recall that there's already a ballot initiative measure underway in California that hopes to put a bill on the ballot that would require the mandatory labeling of genetically engineered ingredients in California. Combine that with Washington, and then you only have Oregon left out of the scene. You could have the entire West Coast, a new realm of mandatory GMO labeling that could set a precedent to spread to the rest of the states. Now, moving on, more breaking news. Ron Paul receives a game-changing endorsement from a South Carolina senator. This is a big deal. The state Senator Tom Davis from South Carolina is considered a heavyweight, a very influential individual in that state. And he says this is his quote, "There's only one person speaking to what I believe is the core problem of our country today. The biggest threat to our liberty comes from debt. There is only one candidate that is talking about this problem to the degree, at the scale, and with the scope that it needs to be talked about. You can't nibble around the edges anymore." And we now have a short video clip of State Senator Tom Davis explaining more.
We need drastic, radical return to the principles this country was founded upon. And if you look at Dr. Paul, and if you look at the lonely battle that he's fought up there in Washington, D.C., and if you look at the courage that he has shown, and if you looked at the withstanding of the pressure that I know he's under, because I feel it in Colombia. I feel it in Colombia all the time. Corporations are out there with their lobbyists, and they want handouts, they want subsidies, they want loopholes, they want grants, they want special treatment, they want crony capitalism, and it is rotting out our republic from the very core. That's what's happening in South Carolina. And talking about the Federal Reserve, and talking about quantitative easing, and talking about monetary policy, and talking about how it devalues our dollar, and talking about that Keynesian pumping in our economy, he has brought to the forefront ideas that 5 or 6 years ago people had no idea what you were talking about. Now everybody in this field talking about it. We have Dr. Ron Paul to thank for that.
All right, well, the audio wasn't great on that, but the important point is that Tom Davis has officially and publicly endorsed Ron Paul for president. That's a very powerful endorsement. We now have a short video clip from Jesse Benton, who's talking about how Ron Paul is now surging in the polls.
We're surging in South Carolina. We've got the resources, we've got the grassroots, and most importantly, we've got the winning message. People in South Carolina are looking for a candidate that will really cut the spending, be serious about this debt that we've got exploding, and really go to the White House to cut the spending and get this government under control. They know Dr. Paul's got the credibility, and Dr. Paul will do what he says. Well, we're surging in South Carolina. We've got the resources.
The good news is that over $1.3 million has already been raised in South Carolina for Ron Paul's election. And a lot more of that coming, no doubt, with future money bombs. Now, moving on to additional news that still involves Ron Paul, however. Look at the outreach of the outrageous, overreaching, tyrannical actions of the EPA. I mean, this is an agency that's completely out of control. The U.S. Supreme Court has now heard the opening arguments of a case known as Sackett versus the EPA. And Ron Paul calls it an outrageous overreach of the EPA. And in his address, he talked about it. He says, unless Congress acts, EPA bureaucrats will continue to inflict potentially devastating economic consequences on communities like Matagorda County and people like the Sacketts. Destroying the economy is no way to save the environment. A thriving economy and a fair judicial system that respects property rights and the Constitution provides the best protection of the environment. We also have a video clip of Ron Paul's address that covers this very issue. Let's go to that.
Last week, the Supreme Court heard arguments in Sackett versus EPA, a case of blatant federal agency overreach and abuse of private property rights. Without any proof or reason and no chance for appeal, the EPA determined that a small single home lot was a protected wetland. The owners, Mike and Chantel Sackett, were ordered to halt construction already underway, to remove all the work already done and plant trees and shrubs consistent with a wetlands environment. After making these costly changes, the Sacketts then would have to wait several years for the EPA to decide if they would be allowed the use of their own property. Refusal to comply with these outrageous and arbitrary commandments would result in daily fines greater than the value of the property. Outraged, the Sacketts sought relief through the courts, but court after court determined that they had no standing. The actions of the EPA were not subject to judicial review until a mountain of fees had already been assessed. This is just another example not only of how federal agencies wield enormous power over the average citizens, but also how little practical protection our courts provide when such citizens are harmed by those agencies. Constitutionally, when the government determines private property is needed for public use, it is taken through eminent domain. In that process, the owner is due fair market value in compensation for their condemned property. The EPA not only refuses to compensate the Sacketts for effectively taking their land, they are assessing or threatening to assess ruinous penalties that greatly exceed the value of the land. They arrogantly claim the power to determine how certain property owners can use their land while assessing fees or ordering actions that must be undertaken at the property owner's expense. All of this is done at the administrative level with no judicial oversight. In short, the EPA does not believe the Constitution applies to them.
One of the key statements from Ron Paul there that you just heard is that this has been done at the administrative level with no judicial oversight. This is the rise of tyranny that attorney Jonathan Emord warned us about in his book by that name, The Rise of Tyranny, where he warned that all of these agencies, the EPA, the FTC, the DEA, the FDA, DHS, of course, they have all become their own tyrannical kingdoms, not subject to legal review, not subject to any of the courts. They simply invent their own law, they implement it in any way they want, and they have become little fiefdom tyrannies in America. And that's what we're seeing now waged against the innocent landowners in this case. I mean, think about it. They just bought a lot, they want to build on it, and now they have to go through all this crazy hoop jumping by the EPA, and they still can't build on it, and it could cost them more than the lot is worth just to pay the fines to the EPA. I'm so glad Ron Paul helps bring some common sense to the forefront on that issue. Now, on another issue that might seem a little bit outlandish, we have radioactive products have made their way into the United States and were distributed to retail stores, Bed Bath and Beyond, in 20 different states, in fact, have been found to be selling radioactive metallic tissue holders. Now, these products are made with cobalt-60, a highly radioactive substance that's actually used in radiotherapy devices. Yeah, they actually fry cancer tumors to death. They emit gamma radiation used in medical devices and other types of devices, some military devices as well. How much radiation do these tissue holders emit? The Nuclear Regulatory Commission spokesperson David McIntyre said that standing next to one of these for 30 minutes a day would expose you to the equivalent of a couple of chest x-rays a year. Well, what happens if you sleep next to one? If you have one on the bedstand by the bed and you're sleeping next to it for 10 hours a night, you're going to get the equivalent of potentially 100 or a couple of 100 chest x-rays a year. And interestingly, the mainstream media, well, the corporate-run hoax media, we should say, has said there is no danger for possessing one of these devices, but they failed to say that if you are caught with one of these devices, you could be arrested, detained, prosecuted and interrogated under both the U.S. Patriot Act for having a weapon of mass destruction, as well as the NDAA, recently signed by Obama. Yeah, you have materials to make a dirty bomb, and you bought it at Bed Bath & Beyond. In fact, you could get arrested by the TSA at a roadside checkpoint just trying to return the product and get your money back. And if you bury it in the yard, well, the EPA comes in and seizes your entire property and says you can't build anything on it. So what do? You're now stuck as a victim in a police state society that's selling you radioactive products and then accusing you for having the random bad luck to get cancer. It's a crazy world, yeah. Speaking of cancer, moving on to thyroid cancer, doctors are now scratching their heads and wondering why thyroid cancer cases are on the rise in America. Thyroid cancer has been skyrocketing faster than any other form of cancer. The National Cancer Institute has statistics that suggest the number of cases has increased by about 6.5%. I believe that's an annual number. Over a decade, that has added up to making thyroid cancer the fastest increasing cancer. We have thyroid cancer specialists who say, or one woman says, 10 years ago, if I saw 4 new thyroid cancer patients a year, that would have been a lot. That's from G. Irene Miner, a radiation oncologist with Indiana University Health Central Indiana Cancer Center. Now, she says, sometimes I see that many in a month, and I have seen 3 in a week. What makes you wonder what's going on with all of the cancer? What's behind it? What are the causes? Well, USA Today reports that obesity, radiation exposure, and diets low in fruits and vegetables are 3 potential culprits. And they're quoting a man named Huntley there. You notice they don't say Fukushima? You notice they don't say radiation from nuclear accidents blowing over into North America, dropping onto your soils and getting into your food? You notice they don't mention the radioactive products that you might be purchasing from Bed Bath & Beyond? No, you're not eating enough fruits and vegetables. That's their only answer. It's quite remarkable, but this is just another example of how the corporate-run media downplays real dangers. Radiation is a real danger to your health, while exaggerating fake imaginary dangers like the war on terror, which is mostly just engineered and fabricated, as you well know, as a regular viewer of INFOWARS Nightly News. Now, we have more news for you here tonight. The LA Times is reporting the TSA, speaking of radiation, the TSA plans now, after so much pressure on it, to test the machines and test the workers there at the airports. The TSA says it's going to test its airport scanner operators for radiation exposure. That's right. After years of rebuffing health concerns over airport scanners, they say they plan to conduct new tests. Well, hey, they can say they plan to do anything. They said they plan to stop molesting your grandma and removing her colostomy bag while she was sitting in her wheelchair trying to get through airport security. But did they stop doing that? No. They said they